Okay, YouTubers, this is Old John. Today I'm going to make a video on a subject dear to my heart, and that is knowledge. Being a retired engineer, civil engineer that is, I've always enjoyed increasing my knowledge. It was a requirement obviously as I was growing up and training, but now that I'm retired I just enjoy doing it, learning more about the world and about the possible future of the world and the history of the world. So I'm going to talk about knowledge. There's a book that specifically addresses knowledge and how knowledge will increase as we get closer to the culmination of history as we know it. Some would say it's the end times, or the arriving return of Jesus of the Old and New Testament, the Christian God. We're going to look at Daniel, which is one of the older books in the Bible, written by the prophet Daniel. In captivity, the Jews in Israel violated God's law, and so he had them carried away into Babylon, which curiously is today in Iraq, and the city's being rebuilt supposedly, and that may or may not play some power in the end times. But anyway, he wrote the book of Daniel approximately 600 BC, and while there he had some visions, and specifically in Daniel 12 verse 4 he was told by God, shut up the words, which in today's language possibly means put them in code, and seal the book. And that was meaning to seal it at that time because people wouldn't understand it, because it was meant for a future time of future event. And then even to the time of the end, many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. There are two ways of interpreting this. One is knowledge will increase in religion, and this has certainly happened. We've found books in the Qumran caves in Israel showing that many portions of the Old Testament scrolls that were found that were very old, when you compare them to current translations, there's literally no change. So that shows us that the Bible has not changed over the years. Some would like you to believe that there have been changes and additions and so forth, but the Qumran cave scrolls just prove that. But anyway, we've been able to see more things happening that are predicted in the Bible. So these are ways that knowledge has increased in relative to the Bible. Another way of interpreting this is that knowledge will be increased. Knowledge of technology and so forth. So I'm going to go through that today because I think it makes for a very interesting exercise. So let's start off with a good place for knowledge, where knowledge as we know it has always occurred in the past as we were growing up, in a library. And this is an old library, I think maybe in Alexandria, Egypt, which was famous for all of its library books and so forth at the time when Jesus was a small child. But at any rate, I'm going to draw a graph for us here about knowledge. So obviously the graph's going to be entitled Knowledge Will Increase. A graph needs a line, so we'll put that on, and we're going to start at year 0, which would be around the birth of Christ, and then divide year 1000 and 2000 and beyond. This right graph line would represent approximately today. Then I'm going to put a line on here representing knowledge as it's increased in red here, and we'll consider knowledge being very limited at the birth of Christ and then increasing slowly until it gets near the year 2000 and then exponentially increases. Okay, so let's look at some of the things that have occurred that have caused this exponential growth. Here's kind of a synopsis. From Jesus' birth to the year 1750, knowledge doubled. Then it doubled again by 1900. It doubled again by only 1950. So you see an exponential increase in knowledge. Then it doubled in only 10 years, and now it's doubling every 2 years. This is brought on by, of course, the invention of the computer, but there are other things that were key also. Let's look at some of those now. So let's look at some of the inventions causing this growth. Inventions I consider very important to cause our knowledge to increase. First being the internal combustion engine, which we used to develop the first car, the Model T. That put us onto the highways and gave us the ability to travel more quickly, haul things. Now we're a nation of trucks and trains to move our goods back and forth across the U.S. and across the world. Then around the 1900s, flight was invented by the Wright brothers in Dayton, Ohio. Then we really started to develop the electrical grid, and that really advanced us. Everything became electric. And then in the around the 40s, the computer was invented. And speaking of that, the first computers used monstrous bulbs and so forth. To the advancement in the ability to make computers smaller was the chip by this guy, Kilby. He came up with the integrated circuit, and this is really funny to look at the first circuit that he made with big globs of solder and so forth. But this was the first integrated circuit using conductive germanium, making a transistor. This then allowed the development of chips. Here's one, the microprocessor history. If you're interested in more detail on this, go to my website, which I will put at the bottom of this video. Here's all the different chips and the history of them as they were developed. Here's an interesting table that goes into the sizes of computers. A byte, which is just 8 bits, single word. Kilobyte, which is about a typed page. A megabyte, which is a small novel. A gigabyte, which is a pickup truck filled with paper. A terabyte, which is one research library. Well, it's actually, there are 2 terabytes in a research library. A petabyte, and as of April 2010, the web was using 8 million petabytes, and then an exabyte, and we're now up to, and then a zettabyte, and we're now up to a yottabyte, which is 1 septillion bytes. And it would take data centers the size of Rhode Island and Delaware to fill it up. So the computer was extremely important, and it's causing knowledge to double every year now. And because of these inventions, a futurist, Alan Tuffler, I think his name was, a few years ago said that because of innovation and the increase of technology, 95% of all engineers ever born are still alive. And that's an astounding statement to be made, but in the context of what he meant, it makes sense. Up until probably the 1800s almost the 1900s, the only engineers there really were like myself, civil engineers. We designed the roads, the bridges, the water plants, and the sewer plants. And that was basically it. But then with the invention of all these technologies, we then needed electrical engineers and mechanical engineers and aeronautical engineers, nuclear engineers, medical engineers, computer engineers. So all these new engineers came about, and if you add up all the engineers that have lived throughout the entire history, all of the 95% of them would still be alive today. So it's an astounding statement, but it's a real good example of how knowledge has increased. Moving on, then the laser was developed around the same time as the computer, and you know how lasers are being used now in all sorts of things. DNA was discovered, and they're actually starting to build and manipulate it now to improve our medical problems. Nuclear power was invented, and I'll leave last here the internet. And of course, with the explosion of the internet, knowledge is just everywhere. If you can get access to the internet freely, that is, you have an unlimited access to knowledge. So I would say Daniel was told correctly by God that knowledge will increase, and if you believe in the Bible and the Old and New Testaments as a Christian, then you won't have any problem believing that Jesus' return may be soon. I will end it with that. If you're interested in more information on this, come to my website and I'll show that below. Old John signing off.